Chapter 7. A Knock at the Door. I have saved him. It was not another of the dreams in which he had often come back. He was really here, and yet his wife trembled, and a vague but heavy fear was upon her. All the air around was so thick and dark. The people were so passionately revengeful and fitful. The innocent were so constantly put to death on vague suspicion and black malice. It was so impossible to forget that many as blameless as her husband and as dear to others as he was to her, every day shared the fate from which he had been clutched, that her heart could not be as lightened of its load as she felt it ought to be. The shadows of the wintry afternoon were beginning to fall, and even now the dreadful carts were rolling through the streets. Her mind pursued them, looking for him among the condemned, and then she clung closer to his real presence and trembled more. Her father, cheering her, showed a compassionate superiority to this woman's weakness which was wonderful to see. No garret, no shoemaking, no 105 North Tower now. He had accomplished the task he had set for himself. His promise was redeemed, and he had saved Charles. Let them all lean upon him. Their housekeeping was of very frugal kind, not only because that was the safest way of life involving the least offense to the people, but because they were not rich, and Charles, throughout his imprisonment, had had to pay heavily for his bad food and for his guard and toward the living of the poorer prisoners. Partly on this account, and partly to avoid a domestic spy, they kept no servant. The citizen and citizeness who acted as porters at the courtyard gate rendered them occasional service, and Jerry, almost wholly transferred to them by Mr. Lorry, had become their daily retainer, and had his bed there every night. So what we find out here is there's a reason why they're living very frugally, meaning that they're not spending any money. They live kind of bare bones, very just the necessities. And we find out there are two reasons for this. One is that they're not rich. They don't have money. Charles had to pay a lot of money while he was in prison for his food, for his board, for everything. Also, it avoids suspicion. If they go around spending a lot of money, it's going to make them look bad. It's going to bring attention to them that they just don't want. Picking up with It was an ordinance of the Republic, one and indivisible, of liberty, equality, fraternity, or death, that on the door or doorpost of every house the name of every inmate must be legibly inscribed in letters of a certain size at a certain convenient height from the ground. Notice the wording here. The people living in the houses are called inmates. So it's not just, it's not the members of the household. They're called inmates, which is a word that is pretty much reserved for prisoners. And so it basically shows you that everyone in France is now viewed with suspicion. But picking up with Mr. Jerry Crunchers. Mr. Jerry Cruncher's name, therefore, duly embellished the doorpost down below, and as the afternoon showers deepened, the owner of that name himself appeared, from overlooking a painter whom Dr. Manette had employed to add to the list the name of Charles Evrémonde, called Darnay. In the universal fear and distrust that darkened the time, all the usual harmless ways of life were changed. In the doctor's little household, as in many others, the articles of daily consumption that were wanted were purchased every evening in small quantities and at various small shops. To avoid attracting notice, and to give as little occasion as possible for talk and envy, was the general desire. For some months past, Miss Pross and Mr. Cruncher had discharged the office of purveyors, the former carrying the money, the latter the basket. Every afternoon, at about the time when the public lamps were lighted, they fared forth on this duty, and brought home such purposes as were needful. Although Miss Pross, through her long association with a French family, might have known as much of their language as of her own, if she had a mind, she had no mind in that direction. Consequently, she knew no more of that nonsense, as she was pleased to call it, than Mr. Cruncher did. So here we find out Miss Pross, despite the fact that she lives in a family that speaks French, she's never learned it because she calls the language nonsense. So her manner of marketing was to plump a non-substantive at the head of a shopkeeper without any introduction in the nature of an article. And if it happened not to be the name of the thing she wanted, to look around for that thing, lay hold of it, and hold on by it until the bargain was concluded. She always made a bargain for it by holding up as a statement of its just price one finger less than the merchant held up, whatever his number might be. "Now, Mr. Cruncher," said Miss Pross, whose eyes were red with felicity, "if you are ready, I am." Jerry Horsley professed himself at Miss Pross's service. He had worn all his rust off long ago, but nothing would file his spiky head down. So where it says he had worn all of his rust off long ago, what it's saying there is he's no longer digging graves. He's no longer a resurrection man. Jerry Horsley professed himself at Miss Pross's service. He had worn all his rust off long ago, but nothing would file his spiky head down. "There's all manner of things wanted," said Miss Pross, "and we shall have precious time of it. We want wine among the rest. Nice toast these redheads will be drinking, wherever we buy it." "It will be much the same to your knowledge, miss, I should think," retorted Jerry, "whether they drink your health or the old uns." "Who's he?" said Miss Pross. Mr. Cruncher, with some diffidence, explained himself as meaning Old Nick's. "Ha!" said Miss Pross. "It doesn't need an interpreter to explain the meaning of these creatures. They have but one, and it's midnight murder and mischief." "Hush, dear, pray be cautious," cried Lucy. Yes, I'll be cautious," said Miss Pross. "But I may say among ourselves that I do hope there will be no oniony and tobacco-y smotherings in the form of embracings all around, going on in the streets. Now, Ladybird, never you stir from that fire till I come back. Take care of the dear husband you have recovered, and don't move your pretty head from his shoulder as you have it now till you see me again. May I ask a question, Dr. Manette, before I go?" "I think you may take that liberty," the doctor answered, smiling. "For gracious sake, don't talk about liberty. We have quite enough of that," said Miss Pross. "Hush, dear, again," Lucy remonstrated. So here what we see with Miss Pross is that she is not being very careful in her judgment of the French people, and she's speaking loudly, and Lucy's like, "You really need to quiet that down. You don't need to be quite so loudly opinionated." Picking up with "Well, my sweet." "Well, my sweet," said Miss Pross, nodding her head emphatically, "the short and the long of it is, that I am a subject of his most gracious Majesty King George III." Miss Pross curtsied at the name. "And as such my maxim is, confound their politics, frustrate their knavish tricks, on him our hopes we fix, God save the King." Mr. Cruncher, in an access of loyalty, glowingly repeated the words after Miss Pross like somebody at church. "I'm glad you have so much of the Englishman in you, though I wish you had never taken that cold in your voice," said Miss Pross approvingly. "But the question, Dr. Manette, is there—" It was the good creature's way to make light of anything that was great anxiety with them all, and to come at it in this chance manner. "Is there any prospect yet of our getting out of this place?" "I fear not yet. It would be dangerous for Charles yet." So Miss Pross asks Dr. Manette, "Is there any chance that we're going to be able to go home soon?" And Dr. Manette says, "Not currently, no. It's too dangerous for Charles to try to leave." "Hey ho hum," said Miss Pross, cheerfully repressing a sigh as she glanced at her darling's golden hair in the light of the fire. "Then we must have patience and wait, that's all. We must hold up our heads and fight low, as my brother Solomon used to say. Now, Mr. Cruncher, don't you move, Ladybird." They went out, leaving Lucy and her husband, her father, and the child by a bright fire. Mr. Lorry was expected back presently from the banking house. Miss Pross had lighted the lamp, but had put it aside in a corner that they might enjoy the firelight undisturbed. Little Lucy sat by her grandfather, with her hands clasped through his arms, and he, in a tone not rising much above a whisper, began to tell her a story of a great and powerful fairy, who had opened a prison wall and let out a captive who had once done the fairy a service. All was subdued and quiet, and Lucy was more at ease than she had been. "What is that?" she cried all at once. "My dear," said her father, stopping in his story and laying his hand on hers, "command yourself. What a discordant state you are in! The least thing, nothing, startles you. You, your father's daughter."